Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Talk, the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. The Thompson Center is delighted to be able to sponsor today's event on measuring the effectiveness of public leadership. We have an all-star lineup of participants today, and I want to thank our moderator, Ellie Powell, and all of our panelists for participating, as well as the Thompson Center staff for all the work putting this event together. Finally, I want to thank Wisconsin Eye for carrying today's event. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few brief words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public leadership. We work to further these goals by offering public events like this one, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the University of Wisconsin system. Part of Governor Thompson's legacy is his reputation as an effective leader during his many years as a state legislator, governor, and cabinet member. I hope today's event will help us to identify and develop effective future leaders like Governor Thompson. Now I have the honor of introducing our moderator, Eleanor Powell. Ellie is the Booth Fowler Associate Professor of Political Science and Trice Faculty Scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is a scholar of American politics, especially the United States Congress, with a particular focus on the influence of money in American politics, political parties, and congressional representation. She received her PhD from Harvard University and was an assistant professor at Yale prior to joining the University of Wisconsin. Her book, Where Money Matters in Congress, examines the influence of money on the internal politics of Congress and the biases it has for the policy-making process. She is also the president-elect of the Midwest Political Science Association. Now, let me turn it over to Ellie.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all for joining us today. This is a really timely topic on sort of measuring the effectiveness of public leaders. It's hard to think of a more timely issue that's facing the country today. American public opinion has shown approval of Congress is in the basement. I think we're at 16% approval last month, and it might have fallen even lower since then. So trying to understand what makes a good public leader, how to measure good public leadership is sort of central to how to understand how to improve public leadership and public discourse. We've assembled an all-star panel today that I'm really thrilled to introduce to you. These are the folks doing leading work on this topic and from a variety of perspectives. And so they're going to present to you some of their research and thoughts on how to measure the effectiveness of public leaders. Today, we'll start with Professor Craig Volden. Professor Volden is a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Virginia. He's also the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. His work has been published extensively on this topic. His two most recent books are incredibly relevant for this topic. The most recent, Why Bad Policies Spread and Good Ones Don't, co-authored with Charles Shippen, came out in 2021. And his prior book, Legislative Effectiveness in the U.S. Congress, The Lawmakers, won both the 2015 Fenno Prize for the best book on legislative politics and the 2015 Kammerer Prize from the American Political Science Association. So without further ado, I'll pass the podium over to Professor Volden. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ellie. It's delightful to be here with you today. Thanks for putting together this panel. Trying to share my screen. It looks like that's working. So as Ellie mentioned, I'm from the University of Virginia, where I co-direct the Center for Effective Lawmaking. The Center for Effective Lawmaking is a partnership between the University of Virginia and Vanderbilt University. The vision that we have for the center is that we envision a Congress comprised of effective lawmakers, strong institutional capacity, and the incentive structure needed to address America's greatest public policy challenges, But unfortunately, as those of you following Congress know, we're not there yet. And as such, the center has developed a mission to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual lawmakers and US legislative institutions. And so we're really focused on this idea of doing research around who are the effective members of Congress or effective state legislators, what could legislative institutions do or do better to become effective at addressing those public policy challenges, and then using that research, getting it out there through our communication strategy. And then the use of that means we're hoping that members of Congress, state legislators, staff, and others use some of the findings that we're able to highlight to become better lawmakers, as well as to have some institutional reforms where legislatures as a whole are struggling along these lines. Undergirding a lot of our research and a lot of our engagement is that idea that we can measure how effective different people are at lawmaking, that some of them are much better able to advance their legislative portfolios than are others, and that is detectable. And so what we've developed now going on more than a decade ago is what we refer to as a legislative effectiveness score. This score is based on 15 metrics all around the bills that members sponsor in Congress and how far they move through the lawmaking process, also taking into consideration how important the changes are that they're trying to put forward. So for each member of the House of Representatives, for each senator, and recently for each state legislator as well, during any 2-year legislative period, so during any Congress, for example, at the congressional level, we're able to look at how many bills did each of those legislators sponsor, and then how far do they move through the lawmaking process. We're focused on 5 stages, not just bill introduction, but also action in committee. How many bills that any individual member sponsored received a hearing or a markup or a subcommittee vote within the key committees there? How many of those received action beyond committee, made it to the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate? How many of those passed their home chamber? And how many of those became law? And of course, we know that not all bills are the same. And so within this structure, we also want to upgrade the substantive and significant biggest issues of the day and downgrade the commemorative bills, the naming of post offices, your National Ice Cream Day, and so on, relative to our middle category, which is substantive, but not the top issues of the day. So 15 metrics, because we have these 5 stages of the lawmaking process and 3 levels of bill significance, where then we assign everybody a single legislative effectiveness score. This is based on a weighted average. So a tiny little addition for those who are introducing a commemorative bill, but things that are more rare, moving towards law, are upgraded, as are the more important issues. We have, therefore, a score for each member of the House, each member of the Senate, per Congress, going all the way back to the 1970s and right up through the 116th Congress. We put out our scores right at the end of each Congress, so you'll see the scores for the 117th current Congress in next February. We make all of these available on our website, thelawmakers.org, where you can go on and click on the House or the Senate, any particular Congress. You could click on any member to see what he or she is doing. Those scores are ones that really help us understand what's moving, what's not moving in Congress, and who are the people who are moving them forward. In addition to these overall scores, we've scored people on 21 different issue areas. And so if you're interested in who is moving health legislation or who is moving education legislation through Congress, you'll be able to find that as well. Can click on different states and look at what's going on in those areas also. Now, crucially, one might think that somebody who's in Congress longer, in the majority party, a committee chair, a subcommittee chair, they're already endowed with the ability to move things forward, and therefore we should take that into consideration. And we do so by giving each member a benchmark score. relative to what everybody else kind of in that category is doing, we suggest here's how they should perform. So there's a higher benchmark for a 10th term committee chair in the majority party and a much lower benchmark for a first term freshman in the minority party. And then on the right, you see that we bin everybody into 3 categories. Relative to that benchmark, are they performing about as well as we would expect, where we give them kind of a blue check mark? Are they underperforming, at least 50% below their benchmark, where we label them as somewhat of an ineffective lawmaker in this particular Congress? Or are they well above their benchmark, more than 50% above their benchmark, where we label them with a green category saying they're particularly effective here? So lots of information available in these scores, and then we use those as part of the center's research community. So we have about 25 different faculty affiliates at a variety of colleges, universities, and think tanks around the country who use these scores and do other work to advance the idea of who are the effective lawmakers. All of these combine into a variety of research projects, but the biggest one going on right now at the center is what we refer to as our Building a Better Congress project. This project has 3 main components. The first is what we refer to as identification. Can we identify the individuals, or rather the characteristics of individuals who, if they were to choose to run for Congress and were elected, they would likely be highly effective once they're there? Our second main category is what we refer to as cultivation. Now that somebody is in Congress as a member of the House or a member of the Senate, what can they do as an individual to be more effective in moving legislation forward? And simultaneously, what can the legislative institution of Congress do in terms of reforms, in terms of rules and procedures to become a more effective institution for lawmaking? And then our third bin is what we refer to as accountability. To what extent do voters hold members accountable, kind of rewarding, maybe at the ballot box, those who are highly effective and potentially removing from office those who are ineffective? And so we do research around each of these areas and then engagement. So I'll mention a little bit more on each of the 3 of those. Our first category, as I mentioned, is identification. Here we're able to look at the backgrounds of people and see if there are any systematic patterns there in how they play out in our effectiveness scores. So as I already mentioned, it helps to be in the majority party and a committee chair and more senior, but controlling for all of those features, we're able to find characteristics such as, one of our early findings is that on average, women tend to be more effective than men in Congress. And where we isolated this in particular was in the minority party. When moving from the majority party to the minority party, women tend to, not all, but tend to keep their issues alive and reach across party lines and still build out broad coalitions. And men, on average, tend to become obstructionists, introduce fewer pieces of legislation, not work as hard across party lines to get things done. And so that finding was then picked up by a variety of organizations like She Should Run or Running Start to help in their mission of promoting more women to run for Congress. We're also working with organizations like With Honor that's trying to promote more principled veterans running for Congress with some research findings that veterans post 9/11 have been particularly effective once they enter Congress. We're also doing work at the state legislative level. We've scored nearly every legislator over the past couple decades across almost all of the states now. And what we're able to find is that those who are effective within their state legislatures, especially if those are professional legislatures, the ones that meet year round, the ones that pay a significant salary, the ones that have significant legislative staff, that combination of a legislature that looks like Congress and effectiveness of the members is something that we found is highly correlated with, once they get to Congress, hitting the ground running and being highly effective there. So we can identify some of the characteristics of people who would be effective once they get into Congress. Then once they're there, we focus on the cultivation, the lessons learned or the habits of highly effective lawmakers here. And then we try to make those habits well known through our new member guide, through some sessions that we have with new members of Congress, new staff, and so on. And there we emphasize some of the research findings. So for example, we find that when one hires one's legislative staff right at the beginning of their first Congress, many members hire a lot of their campaign staff. Many others hire a lot of people who have already served quite a while on Capitol Hill, and they know the ins and outs of that process. And what we find is that that choice of staff, that choice of identifying and hiring highly experienced staff really helps members hit the ground running. They're equivalent to somebody who's already been on Capitol Hill for about 6 years if they hire staff who have been there for a decade or so. Our findings also emphasize the benefits of bipartisanship, emphasize the benefits of aligning one's policy portfolio with a committee assignment and with what the district cares a lot about, really building up that expertise in some policy area to move things forward. This also then leads us not just to individual members of Congress, but to reform efforts. So currently there's the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and they're making a variety of proposals that are right in line with the types of things that our research is suggesting and some information that we've passed their way, such as increasing staff salaries in key ways to keep that expertise on Capitol Hill, such as helping the committee system work to promote expertise and specialization, helping to build networks and build more bipartisanship within Congress. And then our third and final category is accountability. And here our research suggests that voters really want effective lawmakers, but they're often not in a position to know who's effective. And they don't really trust what the members themselves are saying, because everybody says that they're effective and all of their opponents say that they're really ineffective. And so one of the benefits of us being this nonpartisan research organization is we can put out this information about effectiveness. And then we found that it really is picked up out there. When we first released our scores in 2014, for example, we found that members of Congress were writing op-eds about how effective they were tweeting about how effective they were, and then this grew and grew over time. And so in 2020, we, for example, saw a newspaper endorsement of Amy Klobuchar for president, based in part on her being the most effective senator, according to our scores in the Democratic Party. And she emphasized that herself in her t-shirts for the Iowa caucus and so on. And so we're starting to get the word out about effective lawmaking, and voters seem to be interested in and caring about that. And we're seeing that particularly play out in primaries, where those who are ineffective in Congress seem to face more quality primary challengers and seem to lose at a higher level. And in the general election, a little less so, given how partisan voters are in voting not for a Democrat, not for a Republican of the other party, even if they're highly effective there. So clearly still some work to be done in that area. I'm happy to talk about any and all of these sorts of findings and activities, but for right now, just thanks once again for inviting me here and for putting this all together.
Great. Thank you so much, Craig. Our next panelist is Professor Laurel Harbridge-Yong from Northwestern University. Professor Harbridge-Yong is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern. She's also a faculty affiliate of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. Her research explores a range of questions surrounding partisan conflict and the difficulty of reaching bipartisan agreements and legislative compromises in American politics. Her research spans projects on the US Congress, state legislatures, and the mass public. She's the author of 2 books and numerous journal articles. Her first book is Bipartisanship Dead: Policy Agreement and Agenda Setting in the US House of Representatives. Came out with Cambridge in 2015, and her most recent book was on Rejecting Compromise: Legislators' Fear of Primary Voters, which was published in 2020. So without further ado, Professor Harbridge-Yong, take it away.
All right. Can I just get confirmation that the screen is showing up on your end?
Looks great.
All right. So once again, thank you to both Alex and Ellie for organizing this, as well as the Tommy Thompson Center for putting this whole project together. So the aspect that I'm going to be talking about today is ties directly to the research agenda that Ellie mentioned, which is thinking about the role of bipartisanship and compromise in politics. And so throughout my research, I've tried to better understand the extent of bipartisanship, or lack thereof as it may be, in politics. And so today I want to link some of those findings to how we think about effective public leaders and policymaking. And so while bipartisanship is not necessarily essential for creating good public policies, I do think there are several ways that bipartisanship can be important for legislative success. So I'm going to focus on some of the ways that my research suggests that legislative success matters for institutions as a whole, for the legislative success of individual members. And then finally, I want to touch on how primary elections may discourage members from engaging in bipartisanship and compromise, and whether they should. So first, when thinking about the role that bipartisanship might play in legislative success and the ability of institutions to address pressing problems, it's important to emphasize that in most legislative chambers, the leadership has significant control over which bills to prioritize in the legislative process. On many issues, they can choose whether to pursue highly partisan bills or those that can garner some support across the aisle. So in my own work, in my book that Ellie mentioned, for example, I found that the agenda of bills receiving roll call votes in the House of Representatives shifted from the 1970s to the 1990s and more recently in ways that magnify partisan conflict. So bipartisan bills were prioritized in the past, and more partisan bills were prioritized in more recent years. More importantly, though, for what we're talking about today, is that this choice of whether to pursue bipartisan or partisan bills is strongly related to legislative success. So since there are multiple places in the legislative process where bills can be blocked, so for instance, the House, the Senate filibuster, the president, or similar veto players at the state level, the legislation that can become law often needs to appeal to a broad set of members, most often from different parties, and sometimes even just within a diverse party itself. And so my research backs up this point. So bipartisanship is strongly related to legislative success. So even in the more polarized period of the last few decades, the bills that tend to succeed have bipartisan support. Bills like the Affordable Care Act or the Trump tax cuts that passed along party lines tend to be the exception rather than the rule. So even though partisan legislation is common in the House or Senate floor, as I mentioned, kind of part of agenda setting can prioritize partisan conflict, the bills with bipartisan support are more likely to become law. So this figure shows the percentage of bills that have passed the House that go on to become public law. So that is, among the bills that have passed the House, what percentage actually go on to become public law? The solid line represents those bills that originated with bipartisan coalitions in their co-sponsorship, whereas the dashed lines are those representing partisan bills. And what we can see from the 1970s up through the 2010s is that there's a strong negative relationship between polarization over time and whether the bills that go on to become bills that pass the House become public law. And this is true for partisan bills. So with the dashed line, we see a negative relationship or a negative slope here. By contrast, though, bills that originate with bipartisan coalitions continue to become laws at similar rates from the 1970s to 2010s. So even in the more polarized period of recent years and decades, bipartisan legislation still can succeed. A recent book that I want to flag as well by Jim Curry and Francis Lee further highlights this. They find that the issues on the majority party's agenda that are successful tend to have bipartisan support in at least one chamber. So this research suggests that if the majority party in the legislature cares about producing a record of success, finding places of bipartisan agreement or where a compromise can yield bipartisan agreement is an important step. By contrast, if the parties simply care about messaging and don't care about whether they can pass legislation into law, partisan bills may work fine, but it's not necessarily going to get them the legislative success that they may need. So the second thing I want to talk about is that bipartisanship isn't just helpful for Congress as a whole, but it's also helpful for individual members. And as Craig alluded to, I've been part of a project with both him and Alan Wiseman looking at how members' records of building bipartisan support for the legislation they're involved in affects their legislative effectiveness, with effectiveness measured in the way that Craig just described. So in this work, we find that legislators with a higher average proportion of co-sponsors from the opposing party tend to have higher legislative effectiveness scores. And importantly, this is a finding that holds when we control for the host of other factors that can influence effectiveness. So things that Craig mentioned, like being in the majority party, chairing a committee, having greater seniority, a legislator's gender, their race, their past vote share, and other factors. So controlling for all of these things, when a member garners a larger proportion of co-sponsors from the opposing party on the bills that they sponsor, they tend to have higher legislative effectiveness. And this effect is also substantively meaningful. So we find that a 1 standard deviation increase in the proportion of bipartisan co-sponsors attracted is associated with approximately a 6 to 8% greater effectiveness, or this is equivalent to about 2 to 3 additional terms of seniority. Bipartisanship also helps across the stages of the legislative process that Craig mentioned, so in committee as well as on the floor and becoming public law. We also examined in this work whether the benefits of bipartisanship are smaller in recent years. That is, we might worry that as polarization has risen, that bipartisanship isn't valued for members anymore. But we don't find that. We find there's no difference in the effect of bipartisanship on legislators' effectiveness now than there was in earlier decades. And I've provided some examples here to help illustrate the pattern between a legislator's bipartisanship in their kind of co-sponsorship, or in the co-sponsors that they draw into their legislation, and their legislative effectiveness. So the first 2 legislators are examples of highly bipartisan and highly effective legislators, while the second 2 are highly partisan, not bipartisan legislators, and not very effective. So for instance, in the 113th Congress, running from 2013 to 2014, Senator Lisa Murkowski introduced 33 bills that drew co-sponsors. And the average proportion from the other party co-sponsoring these bills was 0.85. Her legislative effectiveness score of 1.63 put her in the top 10% of similarly positioned members. That is using the benchmark score that Craig mentioned earlier. John McCain had a similar record of effectiveness and a high proportion of bipartisanship in terms of the co-sponsors he attracted to his bills. On the other side of the spectrum, we can look to examples such as Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania or Barbara McCluskey from Maryland, neither of whom cultivated reputations for bipartisan collaboration in these Congresses we examine here, and neither of whom had high records of legislative effectiveness. For instance, in the 105th Congress, Senator Santorum had an average proportion of bipartisan co-sponsors attracted of a measly 0.03. So a very small number of Democrats were co-sponsors on his bills. And he had a legislative effectiveness score of 0.19, which put him in the bottom 20% of legislators. Likewise, Senator McCluskey had a bipartisan co-sponsors attracted score of 0.14 and a legislative effectiveness score of 0.16, also putting her in the bottom 20%. So this research suggests that just as bipartisan legislation is more likely to become law in the aggregate, when individual members cultivate a record of bipartisanship, they consistently boost their own legislative effectiveness as well. And in terms of which legislators are able to draw in the bipartisan support for the bills they sponsor, we found that some factors are outside of members' control, things like seniority, whether they serve as a committee or subcommittee chair, or are based on kind of district or ideological factors. There are some things that a member can control. And one of these is that a member's own record of co-sponsoring legislation across the aisle, that is being part of someone else's bipartisan coalition, is associated with drawing in more bipartisan support on the legislation the member sponsors themselves. So bipartisanship is reciprocal in this respect. So far then, I've talked about the benefits of bipartisanship for legislative success. And the last topic I want to address in my remaining few minutes is to think about whether legislators' primary election concerns discourage them from engaging in this bipartisanship that may be important for legislative effectiveness. So in contemporary American politics, with large numbers of relatively safe seats that shift competition from the general election to the primary, legislators may be very concerned about the interests of the primary electorate rather than the general. And this power of the primary electorate can be magnified for other reasons as well. This is the topic that Sarah Anderson, Daniel Butler, and I are studying in recent work. So first, the primary electorate is more likely to be unified in their policy positions than the general electorate. So taking a position at odds with the median voter might cost you more votes in the primary than in the general. Second, voters in primaries are more responsive to the voting record and issue positions of legislators than voters in general elections, where party cues dominate. And so to the extent that primary voters oppose bipartisanship or compromise, or legislators believe they do, legislators' attentiveness to primary voters can discourage them from engaging in the bipartisanship that's necessary for legislative success. And my research with Sarah Anderson and Daniel Butler suggests that sometimes legislators have a misperception, though, that primary voters oppose compromise. So for instance, in our research that we did studying state legislators, we found that legislators who believed that their voters would punish them for compromising were much more likely to reject policy offers that move policy partway, but not all the way to their preferred outcome. And we surveyed them through surveys we sent them via email. Also, we met with legislators at the National Conference of State Legislators. And I just want to show you one of these findings, which is kind of pinpoints that legislators' fears with primary voters. So we asked state legislators how likely they thought voters in the primary and the general electorate would be to punish them if they engaged in compromise. And what we see here is that legislators were significantly more likely to think that primary election voters thought that they thought they'd be either somewhat or very likely to punish them. Whereas general election voters, we see the bulk of responses are that they're not likely or only slightly likely. So overall, 58% of legislators thought their primary voters would punish them for compromising, compared to only 26% who thought general election voters would punish them. However, when we surveyed the public about the same types of policy debates that we had been asking the legislators about, what we found is that generally the public rewards legislators for compromising rather than punishing them. So we gave them kind of scenarios just like we'd given to state legislators. And what we saw is that when legislators compromise, they boost their approval, they boost their likelihood of being voted for compared to when they do not compromise. So this figure shows the effect of the senator in our study compromising compared to not compromising. And this is the effect on approval in the top panel and support on vote intention in the bottom panel. And the key here is that the estimated effects are positive. And this is true among all respondents, as well as broken down by co-partisans of the senator, opposing partisans of the senator, and independents. Moreover, when we look at primary voters, we find that even here, primary voters value compromise. So this is true for approval and even for the likelihood of voting for the senator in the primary, what we see here in the bottom row. So we can look at kind of self-identified primary voters, strong partisans, donors, kind of other proxies for who's more engaged in the policy process and kind of politics. And what we see is that overwhelmingly, kind of on average, people value compromise. Even primary voters reward compromise. They don't punish it. We could only find evidence of punishment if we drilled down into the roughly third of primary voters in our study who were specifically opposed to the compromise at hand. And they did punish the legislator for compromising, but this was a minority of respondents. And so together, these survey results, as well as some of my other research on public responses to bipartisanship, suggest that bipartisanship and compromise is likely to be more of an electoral benefit than a cost. So there may be some subset of the electorate that punishes a member for compromising, but our estimate suggests that this is only a fraction, the minority of even the primary electorate. The general electorate and even most primary voters do value compromise. So in conclusion, I hope the work that I've highlighted today provides some evidence to back arguments about the value of bipartisanship in politics. It helps legislatures enact laws, which helps them respond to problems in the country. It helps individual members build records of success. And I would argue it has relatively few electoral risks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Beatriz Ray. Beatriz is an SNF Agora visiting fellow at Johns Hopkins University and an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow working at the U.S. House of Representatives. Her research focuses on legislative politics and comparative perspective with a particular focus on Brazil and the United States. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ray. Oh, I think you're muted.
Does it work now? Hello? Okay. Am I sharing my screen? No.
Yes, you're sharing your screen.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first academic conference since I became an APSA Congressional Fellow last October. So it's good to be back. I will present a bit of my work on comparative legislative effectiveness. And I come to bring you this talk as both a comparativist, so looking at the US coming from Latin America, and also as a congressional fellow with the experience and the knowledge that I have gained in the last 6 months working for the US House. So I would like to start by just giving you an overview of what's happening outside of the US. People are taking the work of Craig Volden and Ellen Wiseman to other countries. We have people doing that in France, looking at various indicators that measure effectiveness, written and oral questions, bills, both that are introduced, co-signed and successful, legislative reports, and so on. I have colleagues in Mexico who developed legislative effectiveness scores, just like Volden and Wiseman's to the Mexico House of Representatives. And my own research adapts their work and creates scores, legislative effectiveness scores for both bill sponsors and bill rapporteurs, who in Brazil are the lawmakers who write reports on the bills that are introduced and often take ownership of those bills and work towards their passage in the legislative process. In my work, I try to look at the structures inside of Congress that can help legislators become more effective. I work from an assumption that access to information is a key condition for effectiveness, and that there are two types of information: policy information, which is information about the various policy areas and the issue areas and their potential consequences for the world, and political information, which refers to information about the legislative process itself. That includes who can participate at certain stages in the legislative process, the preferences of actors, the institutional setting for action, and when actions can be executed. I assume that effectiveness rests on the combination of legislators having access to these two types of information. In existing literature from American politics talks about political parties as a key institution that supplies legislator with these two types of information. Of course, we have heard from the previous two speakers that there are many other factors, and I'm listing here in the slide just two, but in this talk, I'm going to focus on the role of parties in the US and then what do we do about them in other countries. Parties can help legislators become more effective in many ways. And now, after working in the House for 6 months, I have developed an even more refined view of what this looks like, and I'm going to bring that work into my research moving forward. But you can have in parties thematic groups, groups that legislators organize, that the parties organize for legislators to debate how to implement the party program. You have think tanks that helps legislators with policy ideas to help them draft new legislation. The party programs themselves can serve as a source of political information because they can serve as heuristic devices for lawmakers to learn about acceptable policy outcomes. And you also have the party leadership and their leadership structure, which in my experience in the Hill, I have found very important in terms of aiding lawmakers to be more effective. The party leaders are the actors that know the specificities of the party programs the best. They also have a unique position in the legislature that affords them access to information about the preferences of other parties and legislators, and also the political context of the moment. So this is, in theory, how we think about parties as drivers of effectiveness. However, when you go outside of the US and we look at unconsolidated democracies, not all parties are structured to perform these functions. To begin with, parties may not be programmatic. That means that they might not have any policy commitment whatsoever. So they're not structured to generate any type of information, especially not policy information. But you also have a problem of high fragmentation in other political systems, which increases the costs of cooperation towards majoritarian decisions and makes access to political information very problematic. Just to illustrate, in Brazil, in the last legislature, we had almost 30 parties represented in Congress, which is a very difficult situation for lawmakers who want to be effective, and depends on the cooperation of others in the chamber. My work has been so far dedicated to explaining effectiveness in those cases, and I find that when parties fail outside of the structure where parties function, the congressional caucuses, that, as we know them in the US, supply legislators with policy and political information. These are the voluntary cross-partisan organizations that are centered on specific political issues or themes that act informally. In the US, an example of a bipartisan congressional caucus is the Problem Solvers Caucus. I have work focused on the Black Caucus, which is supposed to be bipartisan, but at the present moment is not. In my research focused on Brazil, so far I have found that highly organized caucuses are likely to fulfill this role, and they are able to do that because they mimic the party structure inside the legislature that can supply legislators with political and policy information. So they have staff and they have resources that can make them fulfill that role. And in those circumstances, the relationship between parties and caucuses is almost a symbiotic one, because the parties and the caucuses rely each on each other, one in each other to achieve their goals. And what you end up finding is the caucuses acting mainly in the informal legislative process as a source of information for lawmakers. I look at Brazil, and I'm also able to draw habits of effective lawmaking that are very similar to the ones that Craig and Alan find in the context of the US. And in my work, I have highlighted how the congressional caucuses in Latin America are able to give information for lawmakers to cultivate this habits. The study of the Congressional Rule Book, which is the document that regulates how procedures happen in each legislature. The development of a policy agenda. Some legislators in these countries, they arrive with their own agendas, but some don't, and then they rely on the congressional caucuses to develop this agenda to acquire policy information. Seek institutional positions and develop relationships with actors in institutional positions, and develop relationships with unconventional allies. Congressional caucuses are a great place for that to happen, because you have legislators who are affiliated with different parties in different positions. So legislators who want to be effective, they are in a very good position to find those allies in congressional caucuses. And in Brazil, I find that engagement with the media is very important for effective lawmaking, and congressional caucuses also help place legislators in a good position with the media. I do find that, of course, the caucuses are not a silver bullet. They're first organized around a family of issues. So you have a caucus for public security, a caucus for agriculture, and Congress, of course, deals with a wide variety of issues. So if you have legislators just committed with one issue, it's hard during the process to make the legislative procedure go smoothly and they participate in everything. Also, caucuses do not have a formal power to be represented in the legislative process. All of how Congress is organized in terms of committee assignments and so on and so forth, it's all dependent on parties, on representation, and on affiliation with parties. So there's a limit to how much caucuses can do in the legislative process. I think this is relevant to the US. First, because I think we should not take the role of parties themselves as structures that can help legislators become more effective. And again, having worked inside the House, I now have more clarity about exactly how that happened. and how the party leadership and the structure of the leadership specifically is able to provide lawmakers with the types of information that I described here. Also, because I want to highlight the parties are the organizations designed and structured to aid lawmaking efforts across all policy areas. So committees don't do that, congressional caucuses don't do that. In the case of other countries, I find that legislators can and they often do adapt to the malfunction of parties and party systems in order to be effective, but this happens at a cost. And studying at the present moment exactly what that cost entails, I'm developing legislative effectiveness scores focused on different policy areas to see, for instance, if Congress is, because legislators associated with these congressional caucuses are the ones more effective, if you see Congress legislating more about one issue and not another as a function of that. I think that is it. I'm happy to answer any questions about my work in the House or my work in Brazil. Thank you so much for inviting me once again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Our next panelist is Professor Jeffery Mondak from the University of Illinois. Professor Mondak is the James M. Benson Chair of Public Issues and Civic Leadership in the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois. He's the author of nearly 100 publications, including books on personality and the foundations of political behavior, and Nothing to Read, Newspapers and Elections in a Social Experiment. Perhaps most relevant to our discussion today is his research on the influence of candidates' non-political attributes on the vote choice, and especially candidates' levels of competence and integrity. So without further ado, take it away.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for being here. This is very nice that the Thompson Center arranged this. As I always said, my interest is in competence and integrity. My interest, in fact, is related to legislative effectiveness, dates back a long time. Being on this panel made me think about this. It made me realize I'm getting older, but the event that triggered my interest happened to be the 1988 US House elections. In the 1988 US House elections, only 7 incumbents lost, and that was actually the event that sparked the early stages of the US term limits movement. Critics were wondering, how could it be that only 7 incumbents could lose? How could we get more incumbents to lose? And I thought that they were asking the wrong question, that we should not be asking how many incumbents lose. We should be more interested in which ones. And all 7 of the ones who lost in 1988 were problematic in different ways. They had just a delightful mix of ineptitude and corruption. And I think if we were choosing 7 to lose, we very well may have picked those very 7. And I would note that 5 of the 7 of them lost after either their first or their second term. And that means that, in my sense, that the system was working, that the system found these people out and evicted them from office because they weren't up to snuff. This set me off on the research that Ellie mentioned about the role of competence and integrity in House elections. More broadly at issue is whether people matter, whether personalistic, non-political attributes matter. And the first question that I set off to answer was, does the electoral system respond to variation in US House incumbents' levels of competence and integrity? That is, do we tend to keep the good ones and get rid of the bad ones? And the answer was yes. And then I thought, well, are voters part of this? Because voters need not be part of this. It could be that strategic challengers see that candidates are weak in these attributes and target them. It could be that it's donor-driven, that donors see that incumbents are weak. But I found that voters do, in fact, respond to information about competence and integrity. So then that got me wondering why this was. Is this something that was socialized in the United States via our system of candidate-centered elections? elections, or instead is this something that voters elsewhere would gravitate toward, even when they have more party-centered elections? And I found that the tendency of voters to factor in, when they have the opportunity, information about non-political characteristics was pretty universal. Voters will do this everywhere if they have that information. And then lastly, I wondered, do only independents pay attention to this? Maybe partisans are just voting the party line, and the drivers of competence and integrity as forces in electoral decision-making are independents. And I found that that's not true. It is universal that even partisans will factor in this information, at least in the extremes. Now, all of this research that I did, which was some time ago, was descriptive. It was meant at identifying patterns and processes. These days, for the last 5 years or so, I've been thinking more prescriptively rather than descriptively. What I've been contemplating is, what would I recommend to voters in particular about how to incorporate non-political factors in the vote choice, and how would I make the case that it's rational for them to do this? Now, as to how this can happen, I believe that with moderate amounts of information, we can evaluate competence, integrity, character, morality, psychological fitness for office, etc. We do this every day. We do this when we're choosing a new doctor or auto mechanic or insurance agent. We do this when we sit down and meet with our children's teachers and principals. And I do a lot of research in psychology and personality traits, and psychologists have shown that we are very good at correctly identifying the personality traits of other people as long as we have a moderate amount of information about them. So it's possible. Now, to be clear, I do not recommend that personalistic factors be the entirety of the decision calculus. I think that that would be sort of silly. If you have a choice between two very good in terms of competence and integrity candidates, you wouldn't just pick the one that scores a little bit higher. If they're both good, you would pick the one that's a better ideological match for you, that has policy positions consonant with yours. So instead, my recommendation is that we pay attention to these personalistic attributes as a first screening step, that any candidate who is below any reasonable bar would be removed from consideration because they're just too low for us to be comfortable with the evidence that points them to being unprincipled or unskilled, not up to holding the position that they are seeking. This is a truncated version of a form of decision-making that's known as elimination by aspects. And Walt Stone, who is going to speak after me, has written about this in the political and the electoral context. The early analyses of elimination by aspects as a decision-making process were developed by the famed behavioral psychologist Amos Tversky. Now, the 1988 elections I mentioned are a good example of this in action. We had 7 incumbents who were problematic for various reasons. We had challengers, we had media coverage that called attention to that, and then we had voters who responded to it and voted out those incumbents. A more recent example from the current election cycle comes from North Carolina's 11th Congressional District, and I'll walk through that just to give you a sense of how I think this can work. Now, North Carolina's 11th Congressional District it's geographically large. It's the whole western chunk of North Carolina. It's about 150 miles, over 150 miles from its eastmost point to its westmost point. The incumbent there is in his first term. He just got elected in 2020. When he got to Washington, one of the first things that he told his staff was that he was not especially interested in legislative activity, that he sought a House seat because of the communication platform that it would provide for him. Unsurprisingly, he easily scored in the top 10% in the House in his first year in office in the number of missed votes, and he closed all but one of the district offices in his district, even though, again, it's 150 miles from east to west across the district. These are unsurprising because he wasn't there to legislate. He wasn't there for constituency service. He was there to get on television. Now, when he was running for office the first time, several women came forward and accused him of sexual assault, and I think that did adversely affect his percentages, but he did get elected anyhow. In his first 18 months in office, which we just passed that period, he twice was caught trying to bring a gun in his carry-on baggage onto an airplane. The second time, I think you would learn from the first time, the second time the gun was loaded. It was unloaded the first time. In a span of 5 months during his first term, he received 3 traffic citations, 2 were for driving just about 90 miles an hour. 1 was for driving with a suspended license. And in one of the speeding incidents, he is seen on video on the police officer's body camera lying to the police officer. A senator from his own state, from his own party, has called for him to be investigated for possible illegal insider trading. This is all in 18 months. Moving to politics, I'm not an especially political person, but in the first 3 weeks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this person referred to Ukraine's President Zelensky as a thug and to the nation of Ukraine as being incredibly evil. So what's the good news? The good news is barely 18 months into his term, his party's voters bounced him out. They chose a different candidate to be the party's nominee in 2022. It was close. The new candidate only won by 1.5 percentage points in the party's primary, but voters, in my judgment, rightly filtered out someone who I would argue was below any reasonable bar in terms of competence and integrity. The new nominee probably will win in November. It's pretty much a one-party district. He has 6 years of experience in the North Carolina State Senate. He worked in several local businesses before that. It could turn out that he will be worse than the person who he beat, but that would be extraordinary for that to happen. It seems highly unlikely that he could be worse, which means that the voters almost certainly traded up, and they traded up by factoring into the decision calculus information related to competence and integrity. Now, why is this rational for the voter? Why would a voter look at a candidate who might be a very good policy fit, a very good ideological fit, and vote against that person on the basis of these non-political factors? What I say is that first, an unprincipled candidate or incumbent might make promises to you with no intent on delivering on those promises. So therefore, voting just for the person who is a perfect fit for you, even when there are abundant red flags about that person as a human being, might not pay off. It might be irrational. You might be better going for the second best policy or ideological fit if you have the information that allows you to trust that person to deliver well in office. Second, an especially problematic candidate or incumbent may turn out to be an embarrassment for the party, doing damage to your preferred party's prospects for success in pushing its agenda because they're too busy doing cleanup for this person who got in. So if we look at the bigger picture when we vote and think not just which candidate is the best match for me, but what's going to advance the interests of my political interests more broadly, including my party, then I think that we would see that voting against people who are real personalistic clunkers would be wise. And then third, in the aggregate, if we are mindful of draining the muck from the bottom of the barrel, and that's really what I'm arguing we should be doing here, then the effect of paying attention to these sort of characteristics will be to elevate our legislatures gradually over time. Yet conscientious people who take their job seriously and who have respectful disagreements with one another over policy, who can work with one another, who can be friends with one another even when they disagree. I think that's where I hope we all want to be, and paying attention to factors such as competence and integrity, I think, are instrumental in that. Lastly, as to my own more recent research, what has happened is that these same sorts of interests that I have had about legislatures have gravitated to an interest in presidential campaigns. And I'm currently about 362, as of last night, pages into a book manuscript about character, morality, and psychological fitness as important criteria for voting in presidential elections. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Mondak. We'll be concluding our set of presentations today with a presentation from Professor Walter Stone. Professor Stone is Professor Emeritus and Research Professor at the University of California, Davis, where he's taught since 2001. He's previously taught at Grinnell College, the University of Colorado, and Stanford University. He's the author of several recent books, Candidates and Voters, Ideology, Valence, and Representation in U.S. Elections, and has written extensively on this concept of valence, the sort of quality or competence of candidates and parties. And his other recent book, Republic at Risk, An Introduction to American Politics, also extremely timely. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Stone.
Thank you, and I appreciate, let me see if I can get this, the share up. Are we good? Let's see. Is that,
Looks great.
there we are? Okay, good. I should say to start that it's appropriate that I follow Jeff Mondak. His work was on integrity and competence in House elections was critical to my thinking about this problem. And so what I'm interested in is the electoral response to leadership quality in a highly polarized environment. And the difference between my work and Jeff's work is that I focus on the choice that voters face in the election rather than focusing only on the incumbent. I'm looking at the choice that is presented in a district election. I want to focus on two questions. The first is, does the leadership quality of a candidate affect voters' choices in a highly polarized era? In other words, in general elections, is it all about partisanship, or do personal fitness, qualifications, competence, integrity, ability to work well with other leaders, to solve problems, and a variety of other factors that voters intrinsically value in their candidates and office holders, do those things matter when they choose between competing candidates? The argument is that, of course, is that they should matter because it's difficult to monitor politicians. Much of what they do is behind closed doors, difficult or costly to know how well they're behaving, and we have to trust that they are behaving in ways that are competent and with personal integrity. The second question I address is, how does individual voter behavior aggregate to produce electoral outcomes? Here the point is that explaining individual voter choice is not the same thing as explaining electoral outcomes. And we'll see in this example that there is a kind of disconnect between what explains individual behavior and what explains electoral outcomes. The study that I'll be reporting on is a sample of in 150 districts in the general elections for the US House of Representatives in 2010. This was a highly partisan election. So in some ways it's representative of the current situation. The unique thing of the study is that we had an average of 31 informants, just what we call district expert informants, in each district reporting on both candidates' leadership qualities and their issue positions. It's important to know that we're not resting our analysis on voter perceptions. We're using these district expert informants to tell us about the quality of the candidates on the factors, the factors that I just described. We have Democratic and Republican informants, we correct for partisan bias, and then we use their ratings as independent judgments of the quality of the candidates and of the positions they take on issues. We also have constituent surveys in each sample district that tell us how they voted, their party identification, and other individual factors that are necessary in the analysis. There are two important candidate differentials that this analysis rests upon. One is a leadership differential, which is how much more highly rated on leadership is the Republican than the Democratic candidate. The more positively the Democratic candidate is rated relative to the more positively the Republican candidate is rated than the Democrat, the higher the positive score, the more positively the Democrat is rated relative to the Republican, the greater the negative score. That's how the variable is set up. There's also a policy differential, which is how much closer to the policy preferences of the voter or the district, depending upon the unit of analysis, is the Republican candidate compared with the Democrat. And here again, when the Republican is advantaged on policy, the score is positive. When the Democrat is advantaged on policy, the score is negative. Within this context, it's possible to think about correct voting and correct electoral outcomes. Correct voting by individuals is voting for the stronger candidate on leadership or on the policy differential. So if the Democrat is stronger on leadership, a correct vote on leadership is by anyone in the district is a vote for that candidate. If the Republican is advantaged on policy, a correct vote is one that is cast for the Republican. Correct outcomes at the district level are when the stronger candidate on leadership wins, or when the candidate advantaged on policy is elected. So I'm going to start by showing you some of the effects of these differentials in the elections. Let's see if I can get the y-axis is the probability of a Republican vote. The x-axis in the first instance is the policy differential, where voters on the left are much closer, are much closer to the Democrat than the Republican, and with voters on the right are much closer to the Republican than to the Democrat. What you can see is that there's a very strong partisan effect, which is the general difference between the red curve and the blue curve, but that Republicans, as they get closer relative to the Democrat relative to the candidate in their own party, are significantly less likely to vote for the Republican and somewhat more likely to vote for the Democrat. Likewise, Democrats that are closer to the Republicans, are more likely, as they get closer to the Republican on policy, to vote against their own party. The leadership effects are on the right-hand curve and graph, and sorry, I'm not very good at this, obviously. And you can see that the curves are not nearly as strong. There is clearly a partisan effect. When the leadership differential favors the Democrat, Republicans are somewhat less likely to vote for the Republican, but only slightly less. That's a significant and robust effect in both parties, but it's obviously much weaker than the effect of policy. When assessing correct voting, it's important to recognize that voters often rely on cues or proxy decision rules, or sometimes referred to as heuristics, to vote. And political party identification is a very powerful cue or heuristic for voters to vote correctly on policy. You can see that 78% of the sample was in the overlap condition between party and policy. In other words, they're liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans. And when they're in that overlap position, they're very likely to cast a correct policy vote. That is to say, 95% voted correctly when they're in that happy overlapping condition. Some voters insist they have no partisan predisposition. We call them strict independents. That's about 10% of the sample. It's a small minority. Their level of policy correct voting drops. They don't have that access to the partisan cue. It drops to 65%. And about 12% of the sample was in a party policy conflict situation. Relatively liberal Republicans or relatively conservative Democrats. And in that situation, you can see that only 20% voted correctly on policy. Most of the voters voted with their party rather than their policy preferences. Leadership doesn't have a cue that is as apparent as policy and party. The best we can do is incumbency, following, in fact, the logic that Jeff just articulated. When an incumbent is doing a bad job, voters pick up signals from the challenger, from the fact the challenger is well-funded, the challenger may be more highly qualified, and so on. And then when incumbents are staying out of trouble, doing a good job, those factors tend to be lowered. Only 62% of the sample, however, is in the overlap condition with respect to incumbency and leadership, meaning that the incumbent is the candidate rated more highly on leadership. And of those, 59% voted correctly on leadership. In open seats where there is no incumbency queue, that's 12% of the sample, and correct voting on leadership drops to 44%. And when incumbency and leadership are in conflict, a little less than half vote correctly. We can also, I'm not sure if, can everybody see the right-hand column? Sorry, is that visible? On mine, it's blocked, but that's okay. I know what's in there as long as you can see it. When voters are aligned and districts are aligned, what we mean by that is that the same candidate that's rated higher on leadership is also closer to the voter or the district in their policy positions. And when voters are in that happy situation, 87% of them vote correctly on both leadership and policy. Only 13% of voters in that situation vote for the wrong candidate. That is to say, the candidate weaker on leadership and less desirable on policy. But you can see that at the district level, voting for the correct candidate drops to about 2/3 of the districts producing the correct outcome, and fully a third of districts elect the wrong candidate on those two criteria. What about when voters in districts are cross-pressured? That is to say, the candidate on leadership is not the more desirable candidate on policy. Well, in that situation, individual voters vote for policy 80% of the time, and only 20% of the time vote correctly on leadership. But at the district level, the split is 50-50. Their districts pick the policy candidate, the policy favored candidate 50% of the time, and fully 50% of the time they choose the leadership candidate. Why does this occur? Well, this occurs because policy voting tends to cancel out. You can have a lot of voters in your district that are voting correctly on policy, but they're voting for different candidates because they're closer to the Republican or the Democrat. Leadership voting doesn't cancel out, it accumulates. If candidate A is the more qualified candidate, the more voters that vote for candidate A, the more likely candidate A is to win. That's just a kind of isomorphic relationship. And you can see this relationship in the following graphs. As the proportion of voters voting correctly on leadership in the district, the left-hand graph, increases, the probability of a correct outcome on leadership increases dramatically. But there's no such relationship between the proportion of voting correctly on policy and a correct policy outcome, because policy voting doesn't aggregate efficiently because it gets canceled out. You could have almost every voter voting correctly on policy. And if the district is relatively balanced between liberals and conservatives, then the election is going to be determined on something else, and that might well be leadership. So let me leave you with some takeaway conclusions. First, even in a highly partisan environment, voters respond to the individual characteristics of candidates. They choose candidates based on leadership quality, and they choose on policy, and they do so much more strongly on policy than leadership. However, electorates are more influenced by leadership than by policy because policy voting cancels out and leadership voting accumulates. So I just leave you with the following question. Is leadership quality an antidote to partisan polarization? If we think about Donald Trump and the recognition even by many Republicans that his leadership, there are questions to be raised about his leadership, so that many Republicans were caught in that cross-pressured situation between voting for the candidate that they favored on policy and perhaps considering leadership as a negative factor for that candidate. These are never Trumpers, for example. Well, those voters, some of those voters, not many of them, will vote on policy and vote for Trump, and voted for Trump in both 2016 and 2020. But some of them will vote based on their concerns about leadership. And remember, those votes accumulate more efficiently. Or take the case of Liz Cheney. She's getting a lot of recognition, even among Democrats, for the integrity of her challenge to Donald Trump, and being recognized as someone who is willing to pursue principle over policy and party. She's a very strong conservative, so Democrats have no reason to support her on policy grounds. But I've even seen appeals from Democratic sources to help support Cheney in her contest in Wyoming. So Democrats may well be led to soften their views of the Republican Party when they recognize that there are Republicans like Liz Cheney who are willing to defect from the party based upon these principles. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stone, and to all of our panelists. We have about 15 minutes or so for a little Q&A. So for those who are in the audience, if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. Panelists, you're also welcome and encouraged to ask questions. You can either put them in the chat or raise your hand. While we wait for a couple of questions to come together, I thought I'd lead off our discussion by asking sort of each of our panelists, what we think the prospects for reform are to sort of improve effective legislating. Professor Volden talked a little bit about some of the modernizing Congress reforms, but I recognize that some of you pointed to issues that are sort of more or less fixable by institutional reforms at the congressional level. So I was hoping I could ask each of you to speak just for a few minutes about sort of what you think the prospects for reform or sort of change or improvement in effective legislating is going forward.
Thanks so much. Happy to dive in kind of in the same order, if that works. So we tend to think about it in terms of then our three buckets of identification, cultivation, and accountability. And so for identification, seeing more women run for Congress, seeing veterans run for Congress, seeing those effective state legislators run for Congress. And each of those seems to be on the upswing right now, tends to bode pretty well. Within Congress at the cultivation level, I was speaking a little bit about the Select Committee and many of their reform proposals, increasing staff salary to keep them around and have that level of expertise, finding ways to promote bipartisanship. Laurel will talk about this more, I assume, but they're holding information center sessions in a bipartisan way among committee staffs rather than a separate one for Republicans and Democrats. And then in terms of accountability, that's a really tough one, and that's where Jeff and Walt's work is really hitting home there. What does it mean to be accountable? For us on effectiveness, for others on competence, on integrity, and what about the flip side? The mention of Liz Cheney, she's being blasted by some as well, despite taking that strong leadership position. So that's the one that I still think we really have to keep an eye on. Thanks.
So I can jump in as well, kind of building from Craig's point. I think in terms of the bipartisanship side, I think that there are, unfortunately, kind of some countervailing institutional efforts going on there. So on the one hand, there are efforts like Craig mentioned to have kind of bipartisan information sessions. And, this is something I've seen in other work I've done as part of the Congressional Capacity Project, some surveys they did that, staffers and legislators value and find value when they have conversations together and learn information together and kind of hash out these things. And so, committee staffers are really valuable for that. But we've seen the kind of funding and support for committee staff deteriorate over time, and instead the kind of staffing go on the leadership side and kind of PR and communications roles, which really is more focused on the messaging side of politics rather than, you know, the legislating, or in my case, the kind of bipartisanship that's needed for that legislating. So, you know, I think we have to kind of two different sorts of pressures. So where institutional reform strengthen committees and strengthen kind of expertise and the focus on kind of policy and substantive engagement, I think that's going to help with bipartisanship. But where reforms help kind of strengthen the kind of messaging side, the PR side, the leadership, I think that's not necessarily going to help.
I think being inside Congress right now, I see that there is a momentum with the Select Committee to Modernization one. I think legislators seem they respect the committee for once, and I think that's an important. That's something that I thought was important to observe being there as staff. But I also think that windows of opportunity for reforms will depend on how American democracy develops in the short and long term. And that's something that it's not clear to me. Depends on election results later this year and in how things shape up in the next presidential election. But the fact that you have a bipartisan committee doing the work that the Select Committee is doing is something that I see as very positive in the U.S. Congress.
Yeah, I would just say that from my perspective, input matters, the composition of the membership matters, and that there are incremental ways, bit by bit, where a variety of actors can make a difference. The North Carolina district that I used as my example, the three things happened. The state party's leadership got fed up with the incumbent who I was discussing. A good challenger stepped up and challenged the incumbent that I was discussing, and then voters were willing to be responsive to that and vote out an incumbent who they saw on TV all the time, but were willing to respond to the information that they were hearing about detriments to having that person continue in office. And you know, that I think can accumulate, and we can elevate the input, and that would have an incremental effect on elevating the institution.
Yeah, I just would say that I think the politicians have imperfect information just as voters do, and it sometimes appears to me from the outside that politicians assume that it's really all about party. And I think the kind of research that Craig is doing and the kind of research that Jeff is doing is very important in alerting even politicians to the fact that voters do respond well, for example, to bipartisanship. And that's been shown in several of the talks. And from the perspective of the work I've done, I think when politicians recognize the strategic payoff of individual quality and fitness, and that's the salience of that has certainly been raised in our presidential politics, and I think it's going to reverberate through the political system, that when they recognize that emphasizing that has the potential for a large payoff strategically, perhaps that will put a damper on some of the emphasis on party over everything else. It almost seems with the kind of silos of information that voters have and that politicians respond to, that's emphasized on both sides by a large factor.
Thank you all. We have two questions, and I think I'll just combine them in the interest of time, both related to gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is often on the minds here, folks here in Wisconsin. We have very highly gerrymandered state legislative districts. So from Justin, we have a question: what can be done to counteract gerrymandering when the primary solution, electing people who oppose the practice, seems unfeasible due to gerrymandering? And a sort of secondary question from Lee about how do these dynamics play out in partisan primaries in gerrymandered districts? Does anyone want to take on either of these questions?
I can start things off on this. So I think there are a couple important aspects about gerrymandering and elections to keep in mind. So I think on the one hand, there's kind of an overstatement to which gerrymandering has led to partisan polarization in general. So I think that's one thing just to keep in mind, that gerrymandering is not the only reason that, or even the main reason, that we see the kind of extent of partisan polarization in Congress. Obviously, the Senate is a great example that it is polarized right alongside the House, even though it's not gerrymandered. However, I do recognize gerrymandering does kind of further shift this kind of competition to the primary elections, maybe rather than the general elections. But I think, while there are some problems for that in terms of thinking about, how that might spur greater polarization, I also think in terms of the conversation today, there are some opportunities. Because I think that some of the things that were mentioned, by Craig with legislative effectiveness, or with Jeffery or Walter in terms of kind of competence, integrity, leadership, that's really a place where voters can more easily switch their vote away from an incumbent. So asking them in the general election to go away from their party and side with, someone who's more competent or has more integrity or better chances of legislative effectiveness is going to be a hard sell. But in a primary, that seems a lot easier. So I think, if we're looking for the silver lining in more kind of gerrymandered districts, or districts that just by their very nature are going to end up as kind of a highly partisan skew, that may be a greater place for challengers to highlight these things and to try to shift voters away. But I think with that, you need these kind of surrounding actors like the state party organizations, other kind of groups involved in endorsements, to kind of repeat these sense of information and use these as criteria and kind of tell voters that that's what they should be using.
If I could just say very quickly, I haven't looked at primary elections in the same way that we looked at general elections. But one of the things we found was that voters that are in the situation of relative indifference on policy are more likely to vote on leadership. And primary voters are more homogeneous with respect to ideology. And that may elevate the importance such that even though you don't see a strong effect in the general election, you do see the effect, but you don't see a strong effect of leadership differences. It may be because the primary electorates are doing the kind of screening that Jeff described in North Carolina.
Thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts and your research with us today. This is really a fantastic set of presentations, and I'm really grateful for all of the work and effort you've spent preparing them and for joining us today. I also wanted to thank the staff of the Tommy Thompson Center who did a lot of work behind the scenes.
That would be me.
Yeah, Ruth and Tia before Ruth did so much work to make this happen. So thank you so much to both of you. Of course, to Alex Talk, the director of the Tommy Thompson Center. And finally, I also wanted to thank Wisconsin Eye for joining us today and for publicizing this event. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your summer and enjoy a lovely summer weekend, and encouraged to hear about these sort of prospects for reform moving forward to improve the effectiveness of lawmaking. Thank you so